Scaling your business globally? That usually means juggling multiple tools. One for payroll, one for HR, another for IT, and before you know it, things slow down. Or you could just use Deal. Deal is the global infrastructure for work, powered by AI and backed by thousands of in-house experts. From hiring and onboarding to payroll, devices, and compliance, Deal handles it all in over 120 countries. One platform, one partner, zero headaches. Book your demo now at deal.com. That's DEEL.com/BT.
This is Transport BT, a podcast of BT correspondents.
Welcome to Transport BT, a podcast of BT correspondents. Every week, my colleagues and I break down a business story that matters. I'm your host, correspondent Derryn Wong. Singapore's air hub is the linchpin of the aviation industry. It's the lifeblood of the Republic. With no domestic aviation market to speak of, Singapore has to be a hub through which things flow in order to prosper. But come 2026, flying is about to get a little bit more expensive as Singapore begins its sustainable aviation fuel levy, where passengers could pay from as little as $1 more to more than $41 for a ticket. And also, it's not just passengers, but also cargo that will be taxed as well. But should Singapore, which is already one of the most expensive airports in the region, introduce another tax, and one that is driven by sustainability? Why is this levy and sustainable aviation fuel important? What sort of effects will it have for flyers and for businesses here? Could it increase even more in the future? In the studio with us is Terence Fan of the Singapore Management University. He's Assistant Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship Education, and he has a special interest in aviation and aerospace topics. Welcome to the show, Prof.
Thank you for inviting me.
Can you tell our listeners a bit about your background?
Sure, I have studied aviation for a long time. Actually, when I was very young, I was fascinated by airplanes and how they can connect people of very different cultures and countries. And somehow one thing led to another. Work with places like airlines and airframe manufacturers a little bit. In my role in SMU, I also do research in the airline industry.
Sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is really one of the big topics that has come out in the past 5 years for aviation. Could you explain to our listeners what makes it so important and how is it produced and why is it different from normal fuel?
Well, sustainability suddenly in the past few years have come out into the fore. And we have seen in places like road transport, for example, our vehicles, our cars and buses, we're seeing more of them being electrified. But as far as airplanes are concerned, it's still a pretty far-fetched thing now. The reason is that if you look at the amount of energy that one can derive from each kilogram of fuel, that ratio that we have from jet fuel, for example, is still a very high number.
Energy density, right?
Yeah, the energy density, exactly, is pretty hard to beat. And if you want the performance that we see on aeroplane, which means we can't have too heavy...
You can't have a battery in the plane.
Yeah, then you cannot, you just don't have a viable alternative in the next 5 years. So sustainable aviation fuel is the only way by pretty much not having to change the structure of the airplane and the engines. You just pump the fuel, but the mix of the fuel is such that there will be less carbon impact. So that's the only near-term solution.
And how do they make SAF? What makes it lower carbon intensive?
That's a very good question because remember, the reason why we can't change anything else is because of the energy density, that we can't find anything close. Then how on earth can we actually reduce the greenhouse impact? So then people think, well, what if we use things that are already out in the atmosphere? For example, we already have cooking oil. We already have waste. So by reusing them, we are not going to have to extract more stuff from the ground. So in a way, it marginally will reduce a bit of our greenhouse gas emissions compared with if we don't use the sustainable aviation fuel.
Because they make it from the cooking oil and...
That's the other $1 million part, because some people, until recently, have been trying to be very creative. Hey, anything that's already on the ground, we can use. So then people were like, well, what about oil that we already have pumped? We might as well just call that sustainable, isn't that? So there's been a little, the definitions, and until recently, at least the European authorities have been like, okay, we need to have some specification. We need to have reduced the greenhouse gas emission by a certain percentage for this thing to be certified as
sustainable. So next year, starting from October 2026, all flights from Singapore will have to pay this SAF levy. And the amount you pay depends on how far you fly and the kind of seat that you have. So for an economy ticket to Bangkok, you pay $1 extra. But the other extreme is first or business class to the USA, you pay $41.16. This doesn't sound like a lot to me, anyway, as a layman. But what do you think? I mean, as I said, Singapore is already quite an expensive airport to fly out of compared to, say, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur. Do you think this will have a major effect on our competitiveness?
Actually, a few dollars within a region for passenger flight is something that I think is bearable. Now, bearable in general, yes, but there will be airlines, as we've seen, who are already barely surviving.
Yeah, the margins are
already thin or even negative. So those will definitely complain. But there are also enough airlines that have been doing quite well. They can still bear, based on the ticket prices that we've seen. And the reason we need to ask for that is that because of remember, we've tightened the specifications for the sustainable aviation fuel. So now you need to have some, oomph in order to call your fuel sustainable. So as a result, the amount of fuel that qualifies to be SAF is actually nowhere near what the whole world will need. And the production cost so far at this point is still quite high. It's like we're talking about multiples.
I heard it's 3 to 5 times.
Yeah, it's a few times more than the regular fuel. So if you ask the airlines, would you voluntarily do that? Very few will stand up and say, yeah, we are environmentally friendly and therefore we will do very few. And so Singapore takes this perspective, well, if that's the case, the government needs to step in and to say, well, we need to be fair to everybody, whoever flies out of Singapore, we need to levy a few. Otherwise, some airlines will do it and other airlines will keep quiet and not do anything,
because
right?
some countries, it's voluntary, right?
Well, the leading countries now we're talking about is the EU, the European Union, and the UK. And they just ask the aviation fuel supplier, they say, okay, can you please make sure you have a 2% blend? So then they care less about whether it impacts the airlines in terms of the prices and so on. So it's a slightly different approach.
Just for our listeners, the system that Singapore works on is that they will decide on the target 1%, they look at the prices, and then they will enact the levy based on those prices. But the price won't actually change. It will just be adjusted according to how much they buy. So if the prices go up, we will just buy less fuel and vice versa. So it's what the Singapore government likes to say, fixed price envelope.
So here, the Singapore system, I think the advantages is upfront. You as a passenger or you as a freight forwarder, you know exactly how much is being charged. It's not like, hey, if I go to airline A, actually eventually the bill is that, and I go to airline B, is a different, everything is very transparent. And another advantage of this is that now the Singapore government has this pool of money. So then the Singapore government can say, well, can we pool all these resources? Because we know for all the flights coming out of Singapore, how much in total SAF we'll need. So can we actually make a bulk purchase and then maybe get better economies of scale? So that could be a potential advantage towards this other approach that we see.
Right now, we're going for a break, so stay tuned when you come back.
Lens on Singapore is now bigger and better. The same deep dive exploration of socioeconomic and geopolitical issues which impact our lives here in Singapore and the region is now a video podcast. If watching a conversation is your thing, join Clarissa Montero in monthly conversations about things that matter. Subscribe to the BT Lens On playlist in the podcast tab of the Business Times YouTube channel and start watching today. BT Lens On Singapore, now available in audio and video.
And now, back to Transport BT, a podcast of BT correspondents.
Okay, we're back from our intermission and here with AP Terence Fan of SMU to discuss sustainable aviation fuel and whether Changi needs yet another tax increase. Now, Prof, do you think that this levy has any effects for the wider economy? Do you think it might affect tourism or anything?
Honestly, I think the way people purchase tickets now, they look at the overall price. And I think it's the same for freight forwarders and so on. I don't think people are so picky as to, this few dollars is for SAF and I don't like it. So I think what they're looking for is like the bottom line. So I don't think the impact will be like, all of a sudden, another airline goes out of business. I don't think so.
$40 for a business ticket is
out of like 5,000,
exactly.
is not a big number.
And I mean, how about cargo? I mean, okay, let's see. 1 cent per kilo for destinations in Southeast Asia, 15 cents a kilo for destinations in Americas. And that's still quite little, right?
Yeah, so I think the freight rates that I'm getting quotes from is like $3, maybe $5 or $7 per kilogram. So once again, the few cents, it's not a very big amount.
I do have to bring up that earlier in this year, Changi already increased the tax by $3, one of the aviation levies, and they're set to increase it each year until 2030, not even counting the sustainable aviation fuel levy. So, like we said, Changi is already pretty expensive. Should we really be concerned about how cost competitive Changi is?
Well, let's read through the fine print. The SAF levy is not applicable for people who are transiting or just making a flight connection in Singapore. Right. And the same goes for the airport levies. It's less for travelers who are just transiting or connecting flights. Yeah. So those are the people I think that Changi is most vulnerable to external competition.
Because you would buy your Malaysian Airlines ticket and transfer to KL
because
instead.
I don't have to go to Singapore, right? So those are the places that I think authorities have identified. Hey, let's not rock the boat as much for those people and charge people who are coming into Singapore. And for them, there are less alternatives.
So among Southeast Asian countries, I think Singapore is the first to actually enact a SAF levy.
You can say it's one of the world's first.
So what's the difference between this and other countries?
In Europe, for example, it's very common. So for EU and the UK government to say, okay, by a certain year, they need like 2% minimum of the blend, and then they will increase. But then when it comes to the price, it's anything between the
and a lot of fluctuation as well.
Yeah, and then from day to day, right? So then it's, we don't know what happens, behind the scenes. And another issue also is that the blend cannot, depending on the performance of the jet fuel, because if you fly very long distance, like a lot of planes do out of Singapore, you don't want them to run out of fuel prematurely because you've used the sustainable aviation.
So you mean different kinds of SAF has different energy density and...
Well, officially they're not supposed to, but with all the blending that goes on.
No, but it's really important. Planes running out of fuel.
Yeah, you don't want that, right?
Or bad range,
Yeah, so Singapore's approach is sort of, let's remove that complexity from this equation and still see how it's going to work.
So it sounds like Singapore's really put a lot of thought into it, made it very business friendly, very certain. Are there any drawbacks, do you think? We could end up in a situation where the price fluctuates and we may be using less than 1% of SAF.
Yeah, so that's some of the things I think the CAS and the government will have to determine after 6 months or 1 year of this and see whether or not this levy is sufficient to cover this. At the same time, we also want to see some stimulation for this market to grow this market of sustainable aviation. So that is also important, I think, if Singapore really wants to sort of push this sustainable agenda forward.
But we do have the building blocks here. For example, Neste, which is one of the biggest SAF suppliers in the world, actually has a plant here. Do you think in a regional level, at least, Singapore is quite well equipped with what we have so far?
It is well equipped, but at the same time, if let's say you're an airline, you operate from Changi, hey, I need to pay this extra few dollars, versus this other airport, nearby.
Jetstar, right?
Yeah. Then, for some of them, they may just make or break, so, but hopefully not too many of these operators.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Professor Terence, for all your insights on sustainable aviation fuel. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Next week on BD Correspondence, we tackle sustainability from the lens of green buildings in Singapore. So do check it out. If you have any thoughts or questions about the show, please email us at btpodcasts, that's btpodcasts@sph.com.sg. Thank you for listening and see you next week.
This is a podcast by the Business Times. Find more BT podcasts at businesstimes.com.sg/podcasts. Or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is meant to provide general information only. SPH Media accepts no liability for loss arising from any reliance on the podcast or use of third parties' products and services. Please consult professional advisors for independent advice.